Welcome to the Truth About False Confessions podcast. I'm Alan Hirsch, chair of the Justice and Law Studies program at Williams College and an expert on false confessions. To learn more, visit my website, truthaboutfalseconfessions.com. Now on to today's episode. On the night of May 5th, 1993, three 8-year-old boys were reported missing in West Memphis, Arkansas. Police, aided by private parties, began searching in earnest the following morning. Early in the afternoon, the boys' naked corpses were discovered in a muddy creek bed in a woodsy area known as Robin Hood Hills, hog-tied with shoelaces. The scrotum and penis of one of the boys was mutilated, and all three boys suffered severe lacerations. Autopsies indicated that two of the boys were drowned, whereas the third died from the multiple injuries. Some of the wounds were inflicted by a knife. West Memphis police believed the crimes involved a satanic ritual and considered 18-year-old Damien Eccles a suspect because of his alleged interest in the occult. Detectives interviewed Eccles the day after the bodies were discovered. He denied any involvement and agreed to take a polygraph. The polygraph examiner claimed the test indicated deception, but Eccles maintained his innocence. A few days later, police interviewed Eccles and his close friend Jason Baldwin, both of whom maintained their innocence. The big break in the case came 3 weeks later when police interrogated Jesse Miskelly Jr., an acquaintance of Eccles and Baldwin who reportedly has an IQ of 72. Police grilled Miskelly for close to 6 hours. Eventually, he relented and confessed to playing a supporting role as Eccles and a third boy, Jason Baldwin, raped, mutilated, and killed the three victims. We don't know how police got Miskelly to confess because they did not record the lengthy interrogation. They began recording only after Miskelly confessed. A few days later, he recanted his confession, citing fatigue and threats from police. And despite an exhaustive investigation, police found no evidence to corroborate the confession. Worse still, Miskelly's confession contradicted known facts about the crime. For example, he claimed that the crimes took place at noon, but the victims were in school then and were seen riding their bikes that evening. Nevertheless, when the lead detective was asked on a scale of 1 to 10 how confident he was of the boys' guilt, he said 11. Reflecting that confidence, law enforcement arrested and charged Miskelly, Eccles, and Baldwin, which caused tremendous relief in West Memphis, but also concern. This community in the Bible Belt had come to fear the spread of dangerous satanic cults. While citizens were delighted that the murders were apparently solved, Eccles' involvement reinforced the notion of Satan-worshipping miscreants in their midst. At the time of their arrests, Jesse Miskelly Jr. was 17 years old, Jason Baldwin was 16, and Damien Eccles 18. Baldwin and Eccles had a few arrests for vandalism and shoplifting. Miskelly had no record, but had a reputation for his temper and had been involved in several fistfights at school. Eccles and Baldwin were close friends with similar tastes in music and a shared alienation from the mores of the Bible Belt community where they lived. All three pleaded not guilty to the crimes. After one of his bouts with the law, Eccles spent several months in a mental institution in Arkansas and had been diagnosed with mental illness, including paranoia, hallucinations, and incapacitating mood swings. At one hearing, Eccles' psychologist reported that months before the murders, Eccles claimed he obtained superpowers by drinking human blood. Friends and family, however, insisted that whatever unusual ideas he might claim to have, Eccles exhibited no violence. At the time of his arrest, he worked part-time with a roofing company and excitedly expected a child with his pregnant girlfriend. On February 4, 1994, Jesse Miskelly Jr. was tried in Corning, Arkansas, 110 miles from West Memphis, in order to avoid a biased jury in this highly publicized case. As there was virtually no other evidence, the trial turned on Miskelly's shaky confession. The defense emphasized that the murders had been spectacularly violent, yet left no clues. How could callow teenagers commit the perfect crime? As I recount this case, I'm reminded of a Bob Dylan song, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. It describes an actual case, a spectacular miscarriage of justice, and Dylan periodically interrupts the narrative with the refrain that ends, "Take the rag away from your face, now's not the time for your tears." In context, he means, you think what I've described is bad? It gets much worse. So does the story of the West Memphis Three. The more you learn, the worse it gets. Back to the trial of Jesse Miskelly. In an attempt to neutralize his confession, the defense offered testimony of an expert on false confessions and an expert on police techniques, both of whom believed that the case had all the earmarks of a false confession. With the case resting on a dubious confession, could jurors find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? They did. Miskelly was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison for one of the murders, and, for good measure, an additional 25 years each for the other 2. Damian Eccles and Jason Baldwin were tried together a month later in Jonesboro, Arkansas, 65 miles north of West Memphis. Because Miskelly refused to testify against Eccles and Baldwin, prosecutors could not introduce his confession, leaving them with an exceptionally thin case. But they did have some evidence that had not been available against Miskelly. First, a few witnesses claimed they overheard Baldwin or Eccles acknowledging guilt. However, cross-examination exposed major credibility problems with these witnesses. The bulk of the prosecution's presentation, and their focus in closing argument, concerned Damian Eccles' lifestyle. The state argued that Eccles fit the profile of a murderer, a ne'er-do-well with a history of mental illness and fascination with Satan. They introduced evidence that he dressed in black and enjoyed reading Stephen King novels and books about the occult. They called an expert on satanic cults, who testified that these killings seemed like a satanic ritual because, among other things, there was a full moon on the night of the murders. On cross-examination, this so-called expert acknowledged receiving his degree from an unaccredited mail-ordered college. I should add that if an affinity for Stephen King correlates with being a sadistic murderer, millions of Americans are closet maniacs, myself included. But to be fair to the prosecution, it wasn't just Stephen King. They introduced evidence that Eccles checked out of the library many suspicious books, such as Shakespeare's plays. In addition to the weak circumstantial evidence, the prosecution also presented snippets of physical evidence. A criminalist in the state crime lab testified that a fiber found on a cap of one of the victims was microscopically similar to fibers found on a shirt in Eccles' home, and a fiber found near the bodies was microscopically similar to fibers on a bathrobe found in Baldwin's home. On cross-examination, however, she admitted that numerous fibers are microscopically similar to one another, and that the attenuated matches in this case proved nothing. Finally, the prosecution offered into evidence a knife found 6 months after the crime in a lake near Baldwin's trailer home. No evidence linked this knife to the crime scene, however, and it was arguably less significant than a knife the defense introduced into evidence. The latter belonged to John Mark Byers, the father of one of the victims, who had been convicted of terrorizing his ex-wife and who admitted whipping his son with a belt on the day of the murders. Byers' knife had traces of blood on it, and while testing proved inconclusive, it indicated that the blood possibly came from his son. The jury also heard from Damian Nichols. He testified that his taste in books, clothing, and music stemmed not from any interest in Satan, but rather his belief in Wicca, a pagan religion whose main tenet is reverence for nature. Jason Baldwin exercised his Fifth Amendment right not to testify. In closing argument, the defense maintained that the crime was clearly the work of experienced murderers. The state's own pathologist admitted as much under cross-examination. Among other things, the skin of the penis of one of the victims had been meticulously removed. The witness acknowledged that even he, a trained pathologist, would have great difficulty performing such surgery. He also admitted that the absence of blood and other evidence at the crime scene pointed to exceptionally adept criminals. In order to convict, the jury had to find beyond reasonable doubt that a pair of teenagers managed a perfect crime only to give themselves away by boasting about the crime in public. And so the jury concluded, finding Eccles and Baldwin guilty after deliberating for 10 hours. Following a brief hearing, the jury sentenced Baldwin to life in prison without parole and Eccles to death by lethal injection. In the Bob Dylan song I mentioned earlier, after reporting the disgraceful verdict, Dylan offers a twist on the refrain. Before, it was, "Take the rags away from your face, now's not the time for your tears." At the end, it is, "Bury the rags deep in your face, now is the time for your tears." Thanks to an HBO documentary, the case of the West Memphis Three attracted national attention, and many people who followed it closely doubted the guilt of the three boys. Celebrities, such as Johnny Depp and Patti Smith, expressed their support for the boys. Public support, however, did not translate into victory in court. The three lost multiple appeals. But the situation changed in 2007, more than a decade after the convictions, when new evidence emerged. More advanced DNA testing than was available in 1994 established that no biological material found at the crime scene matched Miskelly, Baldwin, or Eccles, whereas a hair found on the shoelaces used to tie up the victims was consistent with that of the stepfather of one of the victims. Also, juror misconduct in the trial of Eccles and Baldwin was discovered. The foreman knew about Miskelly's confession and shared that information with other jurors, even though it was not evidence in the trial. In 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a lower court to hold a hearing to determine whether the new evidence merited a new trial. The Supreme Court opinion left little doubt that the justices considered a new trial in order. The hearing on remand figured to be a formality. Recognizing as much, and wanting no part of new trials, the prosecutors proposed a complex agreement with Miskelly, Baldwin, and Eccles. The court would officially vacate their convictions and order a new trial. Rather than face that trial, the three would plead guilty while maintaining their innocence, a so-called Alford plea that the U.S. Supreme Court has endorsed. The judge would then sentence them to time served. The boys, now men, would be released, but would officially remain convicted felons and, as part of the agreement, would pledge not to bring a civil lawsuit for wrongful conviction. At first, Baldwin resisted the deal, confident that he would be acquitted in a new trial. But the price of holding out was remaining in prison, and in Eccles' case on death row, and running the risk that new trials would produce the same result. The three young men reluctantly accepted the agreement. They were finally released on August 19, 2011, after serving 17 years. Although they were not officially exonerated, most observers, including the families of two of the victims, acknowledged the innocence of the West Memphis Three. I want to close with what I consider the main takeaway from the West Memphis Three. The case seems off the wall and has garnered vastly more attention than your typical false confessions case. It has been the subject of numerous films, books, and even songs. It is tempting to regard the case as an outlier. But to me, what is most striking about the West Memphis Three is all the ways in which it is typical. Let me list some of the features of this case that are actually encountered over and over again in America's criminal justice system. 1. A confession given by someone cognitively challenged and pressured by police for hours. 2. Police informing a suspect that he flunked a polygraph. 3. The confession getting major facts wrong. 4. Law enforcement nevertheless thinking that the confession must be true. 5. Judges and juries, too, accepting a very shaky confession. And 6. Even when the suspect is exonerated, prosecutors refuse to admit his innocence. We've addressed some of these features in past podcasts and will address others in future podcasts. For present purposes, I wanted to again emphasize that in many ways the bizarre and tragic case of the West Memphis Three is all too typical. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Truth About False Confessions podcast. I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or whichever platform you used to listen.